Evening, friends. Pull up a chair. Let the fire warm your bones. Tonight, we're journeying back to a time etched in dust and grit, where the sky stretches wide enough to hold a man's dreams, and the land is harsh enough to break his spirit. Out here, in the places civilization hadn't quite tamed, justice wasn't always neat. Sometimes it was swift. Sometimes it was wrong. We find ourselves in a town called Redemption Gap. The name hangs in the air like a prayer half answered, maybe even a cruel joke depending on who you asked. It sat huddled in the Arizona territory, sun-baked and wind-scoured, a collection of weathered wood buildings clinging to life beside a creek that mostly whispered promises of water it couldn't keep, a thin ribbon of silver snaking through an otherwise parched landscape. Founded on hope and maybe a misplaced map during a gold rush that never materialized nearby, it persisted through sheer stubbornness, a testament to the tenacity of folks who wouldn't be easily driven off, even when nature seemed determined to try. And presiding over this uneasy peace, this fragile hold on existence, was Sheriff Ben Carter. A good man, folks said, their voices carrying the weight of years of observation. Fair, steady, seen his share of dusty trails and hard choices that would make lesser men turn tail. He'd been the law here long enough for the lines on his face to mirror the cracked earth around the town. But even the steadiest hand can tremble, especially after it's signed off on a man's final breath. After it's sent a soul to the hereafter, our story begins not with a sunrise painting the eastern cliffs in hues of rose and gold, but with a shadow, the long, stark, undeniable shadow of a gallows against the blood-orange bruise of a setting sun. It stood on a little rise just outside town, stark against the vast emptiness, a grim monument only a few weeks old, hastily constructed from rough-hewn timber, yet already looking ancient, weathered by more than just the relentless sun and scouring wind. It bore the weight of memory, heavy and suffocating, the memory of Caleb Hayes, young and lost, and the memory of Sheriff Carter's certainty, a certainty that now felt as brittle as sun-baked clay. The wind, it never truly stops in Redemption Gap. It's a constant presence, a character in its own right. It worries at the loose shutters on the mercantile, rattles the windows in the small, whitewashed church, whispers secrets through the cracks in the adobe walls of the cantina on the edge of town, and carries the scent of dust, always dust, mingled with sagebrush, hot stone, horse manure, and something else. Something intangible but palpable, like regret, clinging stubbornly since the hanging 3 weeks prior. 3 long, sun-baked weeks since Caleb Hayes, a drifter barely old enough to sport more than fuzz on his chin, but with eyes that held the weariness of lifetimes packed into too few years, had danced at the end of Ben Carter's rope, his worn boots kicking at empty air for a horrifying eternity before finally stilling under the vast, indifferent sky. Justice, they called it, swift and sure. Necessary, most agreed, nodding grimly over beers that did little to cut the dust at the Dusty Spur Saloon, or exchanging tight-lipped affirmations over the counter at Granger's Mercantile, the words meant to reassure themselves as much as others. Martha Granger, wife of Jebediah Granger, the man who owned not just the mercantile, but half the town's goodwill and likely held the paper on most of its debt, had been found brutally murdered in the supposed sanctuary of her own parlor, a violation that struck at the heart of the small community's sense of fragile security. Robbery, it seemed the obvious, horrifying motive. an expensive necklace Jebediah had gifted her only months before, a gaudy thing Ben privately thought unsuited to Martha's quiet nature. Gone. More damningly, a simple silver locket, one she apparently wore constantly, tucked beneath her collar, torn from her throat, the delicate chain broken and lying discarded on the floral carpet. And who should be found sleeping rough under the skeletal, lightning-scarred branches of a giant cottonwood just outside town the next morning, roused by the rising sun and the approach of grim-faced men? Who but Caleb Hayes, pockets demonstrably lighter than air, but for a single, terribly incriminating piece of evidence. Martha's missing silver locket, clutched tight in his sleeping hand as if it were a talisman against bad dreams, now become the harbinger of his worst nightmare. He didn't have family riding in on lathered horses, demanding answers or posting bail. He had no partners to vouch for his character, no long-standing reputation in the territory to serve as a shield. He had no stake in the town, no land, no business, nothing to lend him credibility beyond the desperate sincerity in his eyes. Just a weary-looking paint horse, hip-shot and favoring a foreleg, and saddlebags holding little more than a spare, sweat-stained shirt, some dried jerky hard enough to break a tooth, and a dog-eared dime novel. And that hunted look in his young eyes, a look Ben had seen before in men cornered by fate or their own bad choices. He swore innocence, of course. His voice, when he finally found it, past the shock, and the dryness in his throat, was hoarse with disbelief and raw fear as Ben Carter, flanked by a grim-faced Hank, the blacksmith, whose size alone was intimidating, and a nervous but determined deputy Eli Vance, had rousted him from his troubled sleep. He stammered out his story, eyes wide, pleading. Said he'd found the locket glinting in the dust near the cottonwoods downriver, where he'd stopped to water his horse late the previous evening. Just as dusk was settling thick and purple over the land. Thought it pretty, maybe valuable enough for a few decent meals. Picked it up, meant no harm. A flimsy story, easily dismissed, tragically thin against the overwhelming weight of a grieving, powerful husband demanding retribution, and a town terrified and baying for blood, needing a focus for their fear and outrage. Ben Carter remembered the pressure. It had been immense, immediate. News of Martha's death had spread like wildfire, fear and anger crackling through Redemption Gap. Jebediah Granger, his face a mask of theatrical, righteous fury, or so Ben thought now, looking back with the awful clarity of hindsight, stood on the mercantile steps, rallying the townsfolk, his voice booming, demanding swift justice for his dear defenseless Martha. The discovery of Hayes, the outsider, the drifter, with the locket in his possession. It was too neat, too convenient. It satisfied the town's immediate need for an answer, a culprit, a release for their tension. The trial had been a formality, held in the dusty spur, because the church felt wrong and the sheriff's office was too small. The air thick with dust motes dancing in the lantern light, the smell of stale beer, sweat, and righteous anger. Jebediah, dressed in stark black, gave tearful testimony about his beloved wife, his voice cracking artfully. Others spoke of seeing Hayes lurking around town the day before, looking shifty. Circumstantial evidence piled high, fueled by fear and the desire for closure. Hayes, pale and trembling, could only repeat his story about finding the locket, his words lost in the tide of certainty washing over the makeshift courtroom. Ben himself had felt the weight of expectation, the impatience of the crowd. He'd wanted to believe it too, wanted the neat resolution, the restoration of order. He'd pushed down the flicker of doubt, the nagging question of Asterisk, why Asterisk Hayes would keep the locket so obviously if he were the killer. He'd listened to the quickly delivered guilty verdict, nodded grimly, and done his duty. He'd walked Caleb Hayes up those 13 rough-hewn steps himself, the boy stumbling, near catatonic with terror. He'd felt the tremor run through the young man's thin body as he adjusted the coarse rope around his neck. He'd avoided looking into those wide, terrified eyes, focusing instead on the knot, on the mechanics of the task. He'd given the signal to Hank, who stood ready at the lever, his face grim and set. The sharp crack of the trapdoor springing open, the sickening thud, the sudden, awful silence that followed, broken only by a collective gasp from the crowd below. These sounds echoed in Ben's sleepless nights. He'd done his job, upheld the law as Redemption Gap, understood it, brought swift justice, made the town feel safe again. That's what Jebediah Granger kept telling him, clapping him on the shoulder with a heartiness that now felt obscene. Good work, Sheriff. Solid work. Martha can rest easy now, thanks to you. But the wind, it kept whispering doubts through the lonely nights. And sleep, it didn't come easy anymore, offering far-fragmented nightmares instead of rest. Ben would sit late in his small, cramped office, the smell of stale coffee, gun oil, and old paper thick in the air, staring at the wanted posters tacked haphazardly to the wall. Faces blurred, crimes faded into insignificance. Only Caleb Hayes's face remained sharp in his mind's eye, superimposed over the faded ink. That look in his eyes on the gallows. Not defiance, not even pure terror in those final moments, but a kind of weary, bewildered resignation. Like a man who'd always expected the world to deal him a bad hand and wasn't entirely surprised when it finally dealt the killing blow. Redemption Gap wasn't much more than a single dusty street, baking under the relentless Arizona sun, bookended by Granger's Mercantile at one end and the combined livery stable and blacksmith shop at the other. In between sat the Dusty Spur Saloon, its bat-wing doors swinging intermittently, the sheriff's office, and its 2 adjoining jail cells, usually empty, save for the occasional Saturday night drunk, the small church whose preacher, Reverend Collins, seemed perpetually worried about the souls entrusted to his care, and a handful of houses, adobe and clapboard, trying their best to look permanent against the vast, uncaring landscape. Folks here were hardy stock, mostly ranchers running small herds of longhorns in the surrounding hills that shimmered violet in the distance. A few persistent prospectors still chasing rumors of gold that never quite panned out, and the merchants and artisans who served them. They were accustomed to hardship, drought that cracked the earth and withered crops, flash floods that turned the creek into a raging brown torrent, the occasional Apache scare that sent folks reaching for their rifles, the slow grind of isolation. But murder, cold-blooded murder in a parlor, that was different. That was a wound that festered, poisoning the familiar routines and relationships. Sheriff Ben Carter fit the town like an old, worn, comfortable boot, or at least he used to. He'd been the law here for near 15 years, arriving when it was little more than a hopeful stagecoach stop, with a single well, and leaving his own past somewhere back down the trail. He'd seen Redemption Gap grow from that precarious beginning to, well, whatever it was now, a place clinging to life by its fingernails. He was a man of ingrained routine. Morning coffee at the Mercantile, strong and black. Listening to Jebediah Granger hold court among the early risers, dispensing opinions along with sugar and flour. A slow patrol down the main street and back, checking that the telegraph wires humming faintly overhead weren't down, nodding to familiar faces, gauging the town's mood. Dealing with the inevitable drunks spilling out of the spur on Saturday nights, usually steering them home rather than locking them up. Keeping the peace. Simple enough usually, predictable. But since the hanging, the routine felt hollow, performed by rote. The coffee tasted bitter, scalding his tongue but offering no warmth. The townsfolk's greetings seemed strained, their eyes sliding away from his just a fraction too quickly. Or maybe that was just Ben, projecting his own gnawing unease onto them. He saw it, or imagined he saw it, in the eyes of Mrs. Albright, the baker's wife, whose bread usually smelled like comfort, but now seemed heavy a flicker of doubt. He heard it in the forced heartiness of Hank, the blacksmith, whose booming laughter now sounded a little too loud, a little too determinedly cheerful. Even his young deputy, Eli Vance, seemed to watch him differently, a touch of hero worship replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. Eli was a good kid, barely 25, born and raised in the Gap, eager and earnest, quick with his gun, but quicker with a smile usually. He looked up to Ben, had always seen him as the epitome of frontier law, steady hand, clear eye, fair mind, the kind of man Eli aspired to be. At least, he used to. Now, Eli found himself watching the sheriff nurse his coffee longer than usual at the scarred wooden desk, his gaze drifting too often towards the window that faced the rise outside town. His broad shoulders slumped just a bit lower under the weight of his badge and his conscience. "Sheriff?" Eli asked one quiet morning, finding Ben staring out the office window again, the dust motes dancing in the sharp sunbeam, illuminating the newly etched lines of weariness around his eyes. The gallows wasn't visible from here, but Ben didn't need to see it. It was imprinted on his mind. "Everything all right?" Ben startled. Turning slowly, the movement stiff. He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a poor imitation of his usual easygoing expression. "Fine, Eli. Just thinking. About the heat, about the dwindling water in the creek, about anything but the obvious. About the haze hanging," Eli ventured, his voice softer than usual, hesitant to tread on potentially painful ground. He'd been there, witnessed it all, felt the town's fever, but he hadn't given the final order. Ben's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned back to the window, his reflection a stranger's face staring back. Justice was done, Eli. The town demanded it. Granger needed it. Town's safer for it. His voice was firm, practiced, the official line recited until it almost sounded true. The voice of a man trying very hard to convince himself as much as his deputy. But was it? Was the town truly safer? Or had they simply traded one fear for another? A tangible fear of a killer for the intangible corrosion of doubt and guilt? That was the question that gnawed at Ben in the quiet hours, when the wind howled like a lost soul around the corners of the jailhouse. Caleb Hayes hadn't. Asterisk looked asterisk like a killer. Desperate, yes. Down on his luck, certainly. Maybe even foolish enough to pick up something he shouldn't have, but the cold-blooded calculation, the brutal intimacy required to strangle the life out of Martha Granger in her own home. Ben couldn't quite reconcile the image of that terrified boy on the gallows with the act itself. And the locket. Hayes asterisk said asterisk he found it. What if he had? Ben had dismissed it then, caught up in the wave of the town's collective grief and anger, needing the simple answer. Now, that possibility felt like a splinter lodged deep under his skin, inflamed and festering. He'd gone over the scene again in his mind 100, maybe 1,000 times. Martha, lying sprawled on the expensive rug in her parlor, lace collar torn, eyes wide with a final terror. Signs of a struggle, yes. An overturned porcelain lamp, a delicate end table knocked askew, the empty jewelry box on her dresser upstairs, drawers pulled open. Jebediah, discovering her upon returning from a supposed short trip to check on stock at a remote line cabin, his cries of anguish echoing down the street, drawing neighbors. No witnesses to the act itself, just Hayes, found miles away, hours later, with that damning locket. It fit. On the surface, it fit perfectly. It had asterisk to fit. The alternative was unthinkable. Jebediah Granger, meanwhile, seemed to be recovering from his profound grief with what struck Ben as remarkable, almost unseemly speed. He still wore a black armband, still spoke often of his dear departed Martha, his voice thick with emotion when addressing the ladies of the church sewing circle. But the raw, ragged edge of his initial grief had smoothed over, surprisingly quickly. He was back behind the counter of the mercantile, full-time, overseeing his inventory, haggling over prices, his influence in the town undiminished, perhaps even enhanced by the mantle of tragic widower. He'd made a generous donation to the church in Martha's memory, enough to finally fix the leaking roof. A public gesture that solidified his image as a pillar of the community grieving appropriately and moving forward bravely. Whenever he saw Ben, he'd clap him soundly on the shoulder, his voice booming with forced camaraderie. Good work, Sheriff Carter. Made this town safe again. Put the fear of God into any other drifters thinking of causing trouble. Martha can rest easy now, knowing her killer paid the price. Each word, meant perhaps as praise or reassurance, felt like another turn of the screw tightening in Ben's gut. Rest easy? Did anyone rest easy in Redemption Gap anymore? The gallows stood sentinel on the rise, a constant, grim reminder. Business at the Dusty Spur was undeniably brisk, men drinking perhaps to forget, or maybe just because the tension made them thirsty. Preacher Collins wrung his hands a little more frantically during Sunday service, his sermons focusing heavily on themes of judgment, hidden sin, and the difficulty of true repentance. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, mirroring the town's unease. The heat was relentless, shimmering off the baked earth, the air thick and still, tasting of dust. Even the buzzards circling lazily overhead seemed different, less like opportunistic scavengers and more like patient watchers, waiting. Waiting for what? Ben didn't know. He just felt it in his bones, a low thrum of anticipation beneath the surface quiet, like the electric stillness in the air before a violent summer thunderstorm breaks. Something was coming. Something unsettled remained. Something that the hanging of Caleb Hayes, intended as a final punctuation mark, hadn't put to rest at all. It felt disturbingly like only the beginning. He tried to push it down, to bury the unease under the weight of daily duties, focused on the mundane, mediated a simmering boundary dispute between two stubborn ranchers, old Jedediah Smith and young firebrand Will Peterson, whose fences seemed to mysteriously migrate during the night. Hauled Old Man Hemlock, the town's mostly harmless drunk, out of the horse trough behind the saloon for the third time that month, lecturing him sternly while trying not to inhale the fumes. Repaired a loose board on the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office himself. The simple physical labor, a welcome distraction. Normalcy. He clung to it like a drowning man clings to driftwood. But every evening, inevitably, as the sun bled spectacularly across the western sky, painting the clouds in impossible shades of orange, pink, and violet, his eyes were drawn eastward, towards that low rise outside town, towards the stark, unforgiving silhouette against the fading light. The shadow wasn't just cast by the gallows anymore. It felt like it was stretching, reaching back towards Redemption Gap, creeping into the corners of Ben Carter's carefully constructed piece, mocking the town's very name. The job was done. Justice, swift and public, was served. So why did the silence feel so loud? Why did the dust taste so much like ash? And why did it feel, deep in his gut where the truth usually resided, like the real trouble was only just beginning its slow ride towards Redemption Gap? The waiting, the gnawing uncertainty punctuated only by the mournful cry of the wind, didn't last long. About a month after Caleb Hayes swung, maybe 5 weeks, time blurring in the heat and Ben's troubled mind, a stranger rode into Redemption Gap. He didn't arrive with a flourish, didn't announce himself with loud talk or fancy gear. He just materialized out of the shimmering heat haze late one afternoon, like a figure coalescing from dust and shadow, a mirage given solid, dangerous form. He rode a lean, dark bay horse, its coat matted with trail dust, but hinting at good bloodlines underneath, moving with the fluid grace of an animal accustomed to covering long, hard miles. The man himself matched the horse lean, almost gaunt, dressed in functional, dark, trail-worn clothes, practical rather than showy, a low-brimmed, sweat-stained hat, shadowing his face, concealing his eyes. He moved with a quiet, deliberate confidence, an economy of motion that spoke volumes about experience, competence, and maybe, just maybe, violence held carefully in check. He dismounted in front of the dusty Spur Saloon, the busiest place in town at that hour, with a lithe movement, tied his horse securely to the hitching rail with practiced ease, and pushed through the swinging bat-wing doors without a glance left or right, as if he owned the place or cared little for who might be inside. Silence fell abruptly inside the saloon as heads turned, conversations faltering. Strangers weren't entirely uncommon. Prospectors passing through, salesmen, occasionally cowboys drifting between ranches. But this one had an aura about him, an intensity, a stillness that commanded attention without demanding it. He walked directly to the long, scarred wooden bar, his spurs, dusty and plain, whispering faintly on the rough sawn floorboards, the only sound in the suddenly quiet room. "Whiskey," he said to Dusty Miller, the burly, bearded owner and bartender, whose arms were as thick as fence posts and whose demeanor usually discouraged idle chatter. The stranger's voice was low, rough-edged, like stones grinding together in a dry creek bed, carrying clearly in the hush. Dusty, never one for easy conversation, but usually quick with a pour for paying customers, found himself hesitating, an unfamiliar sensation. He wiped the already clean bar slowly with a damp rag, studying the man without seeming to. Hard eyes, the color indeterminate in the dim light, but sharp and missing nothing, peered out from under the hat brim. Sun creases radiated from their corners like old map lines. A scar, thin and white, cut diagonally across one high cheekbone, disappearing into the shadow. There was no hint of friendliness in that face, just a profound watchfulness, a sense of coiled energy. "Just passing through?" Dusty asked, striving for his usual casual tone, as he finally slid a smudged glass and a bottle of his cheapest whiskey across the scarred wood. It was more a probe than a welcome. The stranger ignored the question for a moment. He poured himself a generous measure, downed it in one smooth, seemingly effortless motion, the liquor leaving no trace on his impassive expression, and immediately poured another. He didn't answer immediately, instead, letting his gaze sweep the room, slowly, deliberately, pausing on each face, the ranchers nursing beers after a long day, the hopeful prospectors nursing dreams, the lone gambler idly shuffling a deck of cards, for a fraction of a second too long, making each man feel suddenly assessed, measured. Finally, he looked back at Dusty, the ghost of something that might have been cynical amusement touching his lips. "Maybe. Town called Redemption Gap, ain't it?" "That's right," Dusty confirmed, his hand resting casually near the sawed-off shotgun he kept beneath the bar. "Heard some talk down the trail," the stranger said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on it as if divining secrets. "About a hangin'. Happened here recently. Fella named Hayes." The name hung in the suddenly thick air, heavy and unwelcome, silencing the last few nervous coughs. Dusty's shoulders tensed beneath his apron. He could feel the eyes of his regulars on his back. "Justice was done," he grunted, echoing the town's official brittle line, the words sounding defensive even to his own ears. The stranger's lips twisted again, this time unmistakably a smile, though it held no warmth, only a chilling irony. "Justice," he repeated softly, almost tasting the word, rolling it around on his tongue. "Funny thing, justice. Got all sorts of shapes and sizes, don't it?" He took another slow drink, his eyes still fixed on the murky liquid in his glass, leaving Dusty and the rest of the saloon patrons in an uncomfortable, watchful silence. Word of the stranger and his pointed questions spread through town faster than tumbleweeds in a high wind, amplified by the existing tension. Sheriff Carter heard about him from a wide-eyed Eli within the hour. Eli had been loitering near the saloon, ostensibly checking on Old Man Hemlock's sobriety, but really just soaking up the town's nervous energy. "Calls himself Kane," Eli reported, leaning against the doorframe of the sheriff's office, trying to sound professional, but unable to hide his unease. "Silas Kane. That's the name he gave Dusty. Asked about the haze hanging right off the bat. Didn't waste no time. Gave Dusty the creeps, Sheriff. Said the fella looked colder in a winter well." Ben felt that familiar splinter twist sharply under his skin. Kane. Silas Kane. The name meant nothing to him. Wasn't on any of the worn wanted posters papering his wall. But the immediate interest in Hayes, that felt like something significant. Like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards. "Keep an eye on him, Eli. Discreetly. Don't provoke him. Just watch. See where he goes. Who he talks to." "Yes, sir." Eli nodded, straightening up, eager for the task despite his apprehension. Silas Kane didn't make trouble. Not in the way Redemption Gap usually understood trouble. No drunken brawls, no loud arguments, no cheating at cards, though he played a few hands of poker in the back room of the Spur, winning modestly and quitting early. He took a room above the saloon, in the small, dusty hotel annex run by Dusty's weary wife, Martha's namesake ironically enough, paying in advance with crisp bills that looked like they hadn't seen much circulation. He spent his days mostly watching. Sitting on the saloon porch, in a creaky wooden chair, tilted back against the rough plank wall, hat pulled low against the glare, nursing a single beer or a short whiskey for hours. He'd watch people come and go from the mercantile across the street, his gaze lingering on Jebediah Granger when the merchant stepped outside for air. He'd watch Ben make his slow, deliberate rounds, his eyes tracking the sheriff's progress down the dusty street. He'd watch Eli practice his draw out behind the jail, the rhythmic slap of leather and the click of the hammer unnervingly loud in the afternoon stillness. He didn't say much to anyone beyond curt nods or monosyllabic replies. He ate his meals alone at the small table in the corner of the saloon, his back to the wall, but his presence was a constant, low-grade irritant, a palpable weight settling over the town's already fragile peace, a question mark hanging over the hastily buried events of the past month. Then, little things started happening, annoyances mostly, but unsettling in their timing and pattern. Old Man Hemlock's prize rooster, a noisy creature named General Grant, disappeared from its coop behind his shack one night. Not killed by a fox or coyote. The wire wasn't torn, just gone, vanished into thin air. Mrs. Albright, whose bakery provided the town's daily bread, found her back gate swinging open one morning when she went out to feed her chickens. Nothing taken, no footprints visible in the hard-baked earth. But the feeling of intrusion, of being watched, lingered disturbingly. Hank the blacksmith discovered his favorite horseshoeing hammer missing from its usual hook, only to find it lying inexplicably by the water trough the next day. Small disturbances, easily dismissed on their own as carelessness or petty mischief, but taken together, accumulating day by day, coinciding exactly with Kane's watchful, unnerving presence. It felt like a deliberate pattern, like someone testing the locks, probing the town's routines and weak spots, subtly fraying nerves already stretched thin. Ben found himself watching Kane right back, a silent duel of observation playing out across the dusty expanse of Main Street. He'd walk his patrol route, deliberately passing the saloon porch, catching the glint of those hard, unreadable eyes under the hat brim. There was no open hostility exchanged, no challenge issued, just a silent, heavy acknowledgement passing between them, a current of awareness. Asterisk, I see you watching me, and I know why. One stifling afternoon, the air thick with impending rain that never seemed to arrive, Ben decided he'd had enough of the silent waiting game. He needed to force the issue, get some measure of the man. He walked directly onto the saloon porch, the boards creaking under his weight, stopping squarely in front of Kane's tilted chair, blocking his view of the street. Kane didn't startle, didn't scramble to his feet. He just lowered his chair slowly, deliberately, and looked up, his face shadowed, impassive. "Anything I can help you with, stranger?" Ben asked, keeping his voice level, official, letting the badge on his vest do some of the talking. Kane took a slow sip of his lukewarm beer, seemingly unperturbed. "Just enjoying the ambiance, Sheriff." The word sounded sarcastic on his lips. "Redemption Gap ain't exactly known for its ambiance," Ben countered, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt Peacemaker. "Folks usually find it lacking. They tend to pass through quick." "Maybe I ain't in a hurry," Kane replied easily. His gaze flickered pointedly towards the rise outside town, the bare patch of earth where the gallows had stood just visible over the roof of the mercantile. "Heard this town had a quick hand with justice, the kind that don't leave much room for appeal. Wanted to see such efficiency for myself." We uphold the law here, Ben said, his voice tightening despite himself. The implication was clear, sharp as a razor. Kane chuckled then, a dry, rasping sound completely devoid of humor, like dry leaves skittering across stone. The law's a funny thing too, Sheriff. Powerful, flexible. Changes depending on who's interpreting it, don't it? And who's got the loudest voice demanding it. He lowered his chair fully now, the front legs thudding softly on the porch boards, and stood up with deceptive slowness. He was taller than Ben by a couple of inches, lean muscle apparent under the worn canvas trousers and dusty shirt. He didn't seem physically imposing like Hank, but there was a coiled readiness about him, a dangerous grace. Named Silas Kane. He stated it flatly, not offering a hand, making no pretense of politeness. Sheriff Ben Carter. Ben met his gaze squarely. What's your business here, Kane? Your real business? Looking for opportunities, Kane said vaguely, his eyes sweeping the street again, pausing for a calculated moment on the faded paint of the Granger Mercantile sign. Place like this, full of honest, hard-working folk, sometimes things get misplaced. Sometimes folks need finding. Sometimes debts need collecting. It was deliberately ambiguous, designed to unsettle, and it worked. Ben didn't like it one bit. Long as your opportunities stay strictly within the bounds of the law, Mr. Kane, you're welcome to look. Step out of line, even a little. Oh, I know all about lines, Sheriff, Kane interrupted, his voice dropping lower, becoming almost confiding, yet laced with menace. Know just how easy they are to cross, especially when you think nobody's watching. And I know how damned hard it can be to cross back once you have. He gave Ben a look then, a deeply personal, penetrating look that felt unnervingly knowing, as if he could see the doubts churning inside the sheriff. Then, just as abruptly, he turned on his heel and walked back into the dim coolness of the saloon, leaving Ben standing alone on the sun-drenched porch, the dust swirling around his worn boots, the stranger's words echoing unpleasantly in his ears. Ben's simmering unease solidified into cold, hard suspicion. This Kane, he wasn't just passing through. He wasn't just idly curious about a hanging. He had a purpose, a hidden agenda connected directly to Caleb Hayes, and therefore to Martha Granger's murder. And Ben had a sick, sinking feeling that Kane's arrival meant the carefully constructed narrative of that event, the narrative Ben himself had helped build and enforce, was about to be torn apart. He went back to his office, the small space suddenly feeling suffocating. He pulled out the meager file on the Granger murder, his own hastily scribbled notes, Eli's brief report on finding Hayes, the list of items supposedly stolen, the necklace, the locket, a few dollars from Martha's pin money box, an addition Jebediah had mentioned almost as an afterthought. The notes felt thin now, inadequate, rushed. The certainty he'd clung to for weeks felt like sand slipping rapidly through his fingers. He reread his own report, focusing on the key piece of evidence. Asterisk. Subject Hayes found in possession of victim's silver locket. Subject claims he found item near Cottonwood Creek. Ben had dismissed it out of hand at the time. Who finds valuable lockets just lying in the dirt miles from the crime scene? It defied logic. But what if Hayes asterisk had asterisk just found it? What if someone asterisk else asterisk, the real killer, had dropped it there? Someone fleeing the Granger house in panic and darkness? He forced himself to remember the details of the parlor again. Overturned lamp, yes. Table askew. Signs of a struggle. But Martha, strangled. Not shot, not stabbed, though the coroner, old Doc Higgins, had been vague, his examination cursory in the face of overwhelming certainty about the culprit. Strangling was brutal, yes, but also quiet, personal, efficient almost. Not necessarily the panicked, messy work of a desperate drifter caught in the act of robbing a house. More like something else. An act of rage, perhaps? Personal rage. He thought about Jebediah Granger, the grieving husband, the powerful citizen whose word carried immense weight, the man who had most vehemently demanded Hayes be hanged quickly and without delay. Ben had always liked Jebediah, or at least respected his business acumen and civic-mindedness. But grief did strange things to people. Rage did stranger things. And power could corrupt, could create a sense of entitlement, a belief that one was above suspicion. Could Jebediah have had a secret, something that led to Martha's death? Could Martha have had one? The thought felt like a betrayal, disloyal to the man whose grief he had witnessed, whose hand he had shaken in sympathy. The questions multiplied, breeding like flies in the dim, stuffy confines of the office. Ben felt a cold sweat prickle his neck despite the oppressive heat. He pushed the thoughts away, violently. This was dangerous speculation, bordering on paranoia. Based on nothing concrete, just the unsettling arrival of a shifty, tight-lipped stranger and his own guilt-ridden conscience playing tricks on him. He needed facts, tangible evidence, not gut feelings poisoned by regret. He tasked Eli with digging into Cain's past, hoping for something, anything, to give him leverage or understanding. Send a telegraph message, Eli. Check with the marshals in Prescott, maybe Tucson. See if the name Silas Cain turns up anything. Wanted posters? Prison records? Known associates? Gambling debts? Anything at all. You think he's the one, Sheriff? Eli asked quietly, his young face etched with seriousness, the implication hanging heavy between them. You think maybe Hayes, maybe he didn't? Ben cut him off, his voice sharper than intended, betraying his own frayed nerves. I think a man asking pointed questions about a hanging right after arriving in town, a man who seems to enjoy making folks nervous, bears watching, Eli, that's all. Now send the wire and keep it quiet. Eli nodded, looking slightly chastened but understanding, and headed for the small telegraph office located in a corner of the mercantile building itself. Ben watched him go, then sank heavily into his chair, rubbing his temples where a familiar headache was beginning to throb insistently. The silence in the office felt accusing. A few days later, just as Ben was beginning to think the telegraph lines were down again, or Cain was truly a ghost with no past, something more concrete happened, something that shifted the dynamic significantly. Jebediah Granger stormed into the sheriff's office, bypassing Eli at the outer desk, his face flushed an unhealthy shade of red beneath his sweat-stained collar, his usual booming confidence completely replaced by visible agitation and poorly concealed fear. Sheriff, that asterisk, stranger asterisk. Cain, you've got to do something about him. Granger practically vibrated with nervous energy. Easy, Jebediah, Ben said, rising slowly from his chair. What about him? He was asking questions. Just now at the store, bold as brass. Asking Sarah behind the counter. Asking customers. Asking about Martha. About her habits before she passed. Who her friends were. If she seemed happy. Nosy, damned intrusive questions. None of his cursed business. Granger paced the small office like a trapped animal, his hands clenching and unclenching. And I saw him yesterday evening, lurking around my house after dark, just standing across the street in the shadows, watching. What's he playing at, Carter? Trying to intimidate me? Ben felt a distinct chill, despite the suffocating heat wafting through the open window. Kane wasn't just watching the town anymore. He was focusing his attention, targeting Granger. Did he threaten you directly, Jebediah? Threaten? No, not in so many words, damn him. He's too clever for that. But the way he looks at me, like he knows something he shouldn't, like he's laughing at me behind those cold eyes. Granger slammed his fist hard on Ben's scarred wooden desk, making the inkwell jump. You need to run him out of town, Sheriff. Now, before he causes real trouble. He's poisoning folks' minds. He's suspicious. A bad element. I can't just run a man out of town for asking questions or standing on a public street, Jebediah. You know that. Not without just cause. Not without proof he's broken a law. Ben kept his voice calm, reasonable. But Granger's fear, his almost hysterical agitation, it felt disproportionate. Was he genuinely afraid of Kane himself? Or desperately afraid of what Kane might uncover or reveal? Not without cause, Granger sputtered, incredulous. He's upsetting the peace. He's dredging up painful memories. He's making people talk. That's cause enough in my book. I'm keeping a close eye on him, Jebediah, Ben said, trying to placate the influential merchant while simultaneously assessing his reaction. I won't let him step out of line. Granger seemed only slightly mollified. He mopped his brow with a handkerchief, shot a nervous glance out the window towards his store, then lowered his voice. Just be careful, Sheriff. He's dangerous. I can feel it. He turned and left as abruptly as he'd entered, leaving behind an aura of sweat and fear. That night, Ben couldn't settle. The office felt like a cage. He needed air, needed to walk, needed to think away from the accusing files and the wanted posters. He walked the dark, silent street, the moon nearly full, painting long, skeletal shadows from the angular buildings. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain that never arrived. He found himself drifting, almost unconsciously, towards the Granger house, a neat two-story clapboard structure at the eastern edge of town, set back from the road behind a white picket fence that seemed incongruously cheerful. A single oil lamp burned softly in a downstairs window, likely the parlor where Martha had met her end. As Ben watched from the deeper darkness beneath a sprawling mesquite tree across the street, he saw a figure detach itself silently from the even deeper shadows near the side gate of the Granger property. Lean build, dark clothes, low-brimmed hat, obscuring the face in the moonlight. Kane. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, not trying the gate or peering in windows. Just standing there, utterly still, watching the house, like a patient predator studying its prey's den. Or maybe, like a sentinel standing vigil. Or perhaps, like a man revisiting a place of painful significance. Ben felt his hand instinctively go to the smooth, worn walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered high on his hip. The weight of it felt both reassuring and burdensome. He could confront Kane now, demand answers under the moonlight, force a showdown. But what would that truly achieve? Kane would likely deny everything, offer more vague explanations, maybe even turn the accusation back on Ben. Ben needed more than suspicion, more than Granger's panicked accusations, more than Kane's unnerving presence. He needed proof. Proof of what exactly? He wasn't even sure anymore. Proof that Kane was plotting something nefarious? Proof that Hayes had indeed been innocent? Proof that Ben Carter, sheriff of Redemption Gap, had condemned an innocent man to die based on lies and manufactured outrage? The weight on his soul felt immense, crushing the air from his lungs. He slipped back further into the shadows, melting away unseen, leaving Kane to his silent, moonlit vigil. He didn't return to the office. Instead, he found himself walking eastward, out of town, towards the low rise where the gallows had stood. The structure was gone now, dismantled weeks ago on Ben's quiet order to Eli. The timber stacked discreetly behind the livery stable, but the place itself felt haunted, the ground scarred. The wind whispered around the empty knoll, sounding disturbingly like Caleb Hayes's last choked breath, carrying accusations Ben couldn't outrun. The telegraph reply finally arrived 2 agonizing days later. Eli brought the flimsy yellow paper directly to Ben's desk, his usual youthful eagerness replaced by a grim, troubled expression. He handed it over without a word. Ben unfolded it slowly, his fingers slightly unsteady. The coded message, translated into Eli's neat handwriting, was brief but electrifying. "Well?" Ben prompted, looking up at his deputy's somber face. "Silas Kane," Eli read slowly, his voice low. "Known associate of gamblers and card sharps in Prescott and Tucson territories. Suspected involvement in a disputed claim jumping incident near Prescott 2 years back resulted in 1 man dead, but no charges filed due to lack of witnesses willing to testify. No current outstanding warrants, but considered dangerous and potentially volatile by Arizona Rangers who investigated the claim jumping." Eli paused, took a breath, then continued, his eyes meeting Ben's. "Also, there was another mention, faint connection, from maybe 3-4 years ago. He apparently rode briefly with a loose group of drifters and sometime prospectors operating down near the border. One of the names mentioned alongside his in an old ranger report concerning suspected cattle rustling was Caleb Hayes." Ben felt the floor drop out from under him, the office walls seeming to close in. Kane knew Hayes. Not just heard some rumor about him down the trail. Asterisk knew asterisk him. Rode with him. This changed everything. Cast Kane's arrival, his questions, his unnerving focus on Granger, in a completely different, sharper light. Kane wasn't just a randomly interested, unsettling stranger. He had a personal connection, a motive, revenge for his friend's unjust hanging, or something darker, more complicated, perhaps involving Kane's own past with both Hayes and, terrifyingly, maybe even Martha Granger. He looked up at Eli. His face must have been pale because Eli took an involuntary step back. "Keep this quiet, Eli. Strictly between us. Not a word to anyone." "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice barely a whisper, the implications dawning fully on his young face. "If Kane knew Hayes, and he's here now acting like this, maybe asking questions because he knows, then maybe Hayes really asterisk was asterisk. We don't know that for sure," Ben snapped, then immediately regretted his harsh tone. He took a deep, steadying breath, trying to regain control. "We don't know anything for sure yet, Eli, except that things just got a hell of a lot more complicated and dangerous. We need to be careful, very careful." He looked out the window, past Eli's worried face. Across the dusty street, Silas Kane was back in his customary spot on the saloon porch, chair tilted back, hat low, watching, waiting, playing his patient, inscrutable game. But Ben knew now, with a chilling certainty that settled like ice in his veins, that the game was nearing its end. In Redemption Gap, the town built on shaky ground and named with unintended irony was about to face a reckoning far more profound than a simple hanging. The shadow of the gallows wasn't just a memory anymore. It felt like a gathering storm cloud, heavy and menacing, ready to break. And Ben Carter stood directly in its path. The tension in Redemption Gap thickened like summer molasses left too long in the sun. You could feel it in the air, heavy and charged, prickling the skin. People felt it, even those who didn't know the specifics, swirling around the sheriff, Kane, and the ghost of Caleb Hayes. They walked quicker down the main street, eyes averted, avoiding unnecessary conversation. Neighbors who usually exchanged pleasantries over picket fences now offered only curt nods. The easy camaraderie in the dusty spur evaporated, replaced by hushed tones and watchful eyes darting towards the door every time the batwings swung open. The presence of Silas Kane acted like a catalyst, a chemical dropped into a volatile solution, bringing the town's buried anxieties, its collective guilt and fear about the rush justice for Martha Granger, simmering just below the surface. Jebediah Granger became increasingly jumpy, a stark contrast to his previous confident bluster. His jovial facade cracked, revealing layers of raw nerves beneath. He spent less time holding court in the mercantile and more time peering anxiously out the front windows, his gaze constantly scanning the street for Kane's lean figure. When Kane was visible, lounging on the saloon porch, Granger would retreat hastily to the back office, muttering curses under his breath. His interactions with Ben became strained, oscillating between demanding the sheriff asterisk do something asterisk about Kane and nervously assuring Ben that Kane was just a harmless lunatic spreading lies. Even the regulars at the Dusty Spur, men usually eager for gossip and distraction, drank with less gusto now, their laughter sounding forced and hollow, their arguments muted. They sensed something was deeply wrong, something more profound than a lingering stranger. Ben Carter felt like he was walking a fraying tightrope stretched across a deep, dark canyon. On one side lay the abyss of the damning possibility that he, driven by duty and public pressure, had hanged an innocent man, accepting the too easy narrative crafted by a town's fear, and potentially a grieving husband's calculated deception. On the other side loomed the dangerous, unpredictable reality of Silas Kane, a man who clearly knew more than he was letting on, whose connection to Hayes reeked of unfinished business, and whose cold eyes hinted at a capacity for violence. And beneath him, swirling like a dizzying vortex, was the chasm of his own conscience, plagued by guilt and the terrifying weight of his potential mistake. He tried subtle probing first, needing more than just the old Ranger report linking Kane and Hayes. He sought Kane out again, finding him not at the saloon this time, but down at the livery stable run by old taciturn Samuel, where the stranger was meticulously currying his dark bay horse. The animal looked sleek and well cared for, despite the trail dust, a sign of Kane's attention to detail. "That's a fine animal," Ben remarked casually, leaning his forearms on the top rail of the corral fence, projecting an air of idle conversation he didn't feel. Kane grunted, not pausing in his rhythmic strokes with the brush down the horse's gleaming flank. The horse nickered softly, nudging Kane's shoulder. "Takes good care," Ben continued, watching Kane's hands, steady and sure. "Man who cares for his horse like that usually has pride, certain standards, understands loyalty." Kane stopped brushing abruptly. He turned his head slowly, the movement deliberate. His eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat, boring into Ben's from the shadows of the stable doorway. Something particular on your mind, Sheriff? Or are you just admiring the livestock? Just thinking, Ben said, keeping his tone light, conversational, despite the pounding in his chest. About men who ride together, watch each other's backs through thick and thin, build a bond. Men like maybe you and Caleb Hayes, way back when. He dropped the name deliberately, watching Kane's reaction like a hawk. The air in the stable crackled, thick with sudden tension, smelling of hay, horse sweat, and something dangerous. Kane's eyes, momentarily losing their careful impassivity, narrowed further, becoming chips of cold flint. The easy confidence, the mocking detachment he often projected, evaporated instantly, replaced by a raw, hard edge that was genuinely intimidating. Who told you that? His voice was low, tight, stripped of its earlier drawl. Word gets around, Ben bluffed, shrugging slightly, trying to appear unconcerned. Small towns like Redemption Gap. Folks talk. Telegraph wires hum. Kane straightened up slowly, dropping the curry brush into a nearby bucket with a soft thud. He took a deliberate step closer to the corral fence, the space between them shrinking, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that sent shivers down Ben's spine, despite the heat. Hayes was acquainted with me. Years ago. Different lifetime. We drifted apart, went our separate ways. Drifted far enough for you not to speak up or ride in when you heard he was accused of murdering a woman? Hanged for it? Ben pressed, holding Kane's intense gaze, refusing to back down. He saw a flicker, a brief flash of something. Guilt? Anger? In those depths before Kane masked it again, a muscle twitched violently in Kane's lean jaw. Wasn't my business anymore, he said curtly. Besides, heard about the hanging too late to do anything about it? His eyes flickered away for a split second towards the distant hills. A tell, a crack in the facade that Ben didn't miss. He was lying, or at least not telling the whole truth. Too late? Ben echoed softly, seizing the opening. Or maybe, just maybe, convenient? Kane reacted instantly, slamming his open hand flat and hard on the top rail of the wooden fence, the sharp sound echoing in the stable, inches from Ben's face. The horses in the nearby stalls startled, snorting nervously. You treading dangerous ground now, Sheriff, Kane hissed, leaning in closer, his breath warm, smelling faintly of whiskey and something else, something metallic like old blood or anger. Hayes got what was coming to him in the end. Always played stupid games, took foolish risks, won himself a stupid prize. The callous dismissal sounded forced, unnatural. Stupid games, like maybe picking up a shiny silver locket someone else dropped in the dark down by the creek? Ben countered sharply, throwing Kane's earlier vague insinuations back at him. Kane's face contorted, a brief flash of raw, murderous anger twisting his features before he wrestled it back under control. He leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, meant only for Ben's ears. Maybe you ought to stop worrying about Hayes, Sheriff. Maybe you ought to ask that pillar of your community, Jebediah Granger, about lockets. Maybe ask him about that fancy bone-handled hunting knife he likes to show off so much. Ask him if he's used it for anything other than skinning deer lately. Maybe, Kane added, his eyes glittering with malice, you should ask Granger what kind of man his dear departed Martha really Asterisk, was behind closed doors when hubby was away on business. Ben recoiled slightly, physically stepping back from the fence, stunned speechless by the raw venom and the poisonous implication. Granger, his hunting knife, Martha, what in God's name was Cain suggesting? Before Ben could formulate a response, could demand clarification, Cain turned abruptly, snatched up the curry comb, and went back to tending his horse with fierce, jerky movements, his back rigid, effectively ending the conversation, leaving Ben standing alone by the corral, the dust settling around him, Cain's toxic words hanging heavy and sickening in the still air. Asterisk ask Jebediah Granger about his knife, about Martha. The words echoed relentlessly in Ben's mind as he walked slowly back towards his office, the sun beating down on his hat. Cain wasn't just trying to stir up trouble or cast suspicion randomly anymore. He was pointing a deliberate, sharp finger directly at Jebediah Granger. But why? To deflect suspicion from himself if he somehow was asterisk involved. To frame Granger out of pure malice? Or was there a horrifying kernel of truth buried within his poisonous suggestion? Ben felt dirty, complicit in something he didn't fully understand, but was beginning to dread. He'd built the flimsy case against Hayes partly on the foundation of Jebediah's seemingly inconsolable grief, on the town's sympathetic image of the wronged husband. Now, Cain was hinting, no, outright stating, that the entire foundation was rotten to the core. Could Martha Granger, the quiet, respectable merchant's wife, have had secrets? Secrets dangerous enough to lead to her violent death? Secrets completely unrelated to a simple robbery gone wrong? And could Jebediah, her husband, have known about them? Could his grief have been a performance masking a darker, more terrible truth? The idea was monstrous, almost unthinkable. Jebediah Granger was a pillar of Redemption Gap. Churchgoer, businessman, town council member. His grief after finding Martha had seemed so real, so visceral. Ben remembered the man's choked sobs, his face buried in his hands. But Cain's accusation, coupled with Granger's recent, almost frantic nervousness and his desperate attempts to get Cain run out of town, it planted a seed of poisonous doubt in Ben's mind, a seed that took root immediately and began to grow, choking out his previous certainties. He needed to know. He couldn't function under this crushing weight of uncertainty any longer. He needed to know the truth, not just about Silas Cain anymore, but about the original crime, about Martha, about Jebediah. He started asking quiet questions again, circling the subject carefully, revisiting conversations he'd had weeks ago, listening now with different ears. He talked to Mrs. Albright again at the bakery, ostensibly buying a loaf of bread, casually mentioning how Martha's passing still cast a shadow over the town. Such a terrible tragedy, Mrs. Albright sighed, wiping floury hands on her apron, her kind face clouded with sadness. Poor Martha. Always kept mostly to herself, but unfailingly polite. A proper lady. Though, she hesitated, glancing around her empty shop, as if unsure whether to continue. Though what, Mrs. Albright? Ben prompted gently, keeping his expression open, encouraging. Well, she lowered her voice conspiratorially, leaning slightly over the counter, piled high with cooling loaves. It's probably nothing, Sheriff. Just woman's intuition, maybe. But she seemed, well, restless these last few months before it happened. Distracted, you might say. Like she was waiting for something important, or wanting something she didn't have. Mrs. Albright frowned, thoughtful, and jumpy. She seemed jumpier than usual, dropped a whole bag of flour right here on the floor one afternoon, just because Hank's hammer slipped next door and made a loud clang. Not like her usual calm self at all. Restless, wanting, jumpy. Vague feelings, certainly not concrete evidence. But they added another layer to the thickening miasma of uncertainty surrounding Martha Granger. Ben thought back to the crime scene description. The jewelry box upstairs was open, drawers rifled through. But was anything else missing from the house? He hadn't focused on that specifically, blinded by the immediate discovery of the locket on Hayes. Had he missed something? Had everyone missed something, caught up in the rush to blame the convenient outsider? He realized he couldn't get the truth by dancing around the edges anymore. He couldn't rely on hearsay or Granger's panicked denials. He needed to confront the source of the poison directly. He needed to talk to Kane again, but not as Sheriff Carter issuing warnings or demands. He needed something else. He needed Kane to believe he was genuinely seeking the truth, not just looking to protect the town's fragile peace or his own reputation. He found Kane late that night, long after the dusty spur had closed and the town had settled into an uneasy slumber. Kane wasn't in his room above the saloon, nor was he watching Granger's house. Ben found him sitting alone by the dying embers of a small campfire down by Cottonwood Creek, in the very grove of trees not far from where Caleb Hayes had claimed, desperately and unbelieved, that he'd found the silver locket. The air was cool near the water. The only sounds, the gentle murmur of the creek and the chirping of crickets. Ben approached slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands in plain sight, palms open, wanting to convey non-aggression. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground. Kane looked up sharply as Ben crunched on a dry twig, his hand instantly dropping to the butt of the gun holstered low on his hip, his body tensing like a coiled spring. "Kane," Ben said softly, stopping a respectful few feet away. "Need to talk. Not as the law this time." Kane stared at him, his face shadowed and unreadable in the flickering firelight, suspicion radiating from him. He didn't relax his posture. "What then, Carter? Come to arrest me for vagrancy? Or maybe just shoot me while there are no witnesses?" His tone was laced with cynicism. "As a man who might have made a terrible mistake," Ben admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, the confession costing him a piece of his pride, but necessary. "You knew Hayes. I know that now. And you know something about what really happened to Martha Granger. Something you hinted at back at the livery. I need to know what it is. The truth, Kane. All of it." Kane stared at him for a long, unnerving moment, the silence stretching, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the murmur of the creek. The firelight flickered in his hard eyes, seeming to search Ben's face, weighing his sincerity, calculating the risks. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, some of the tension seemed to ease out of his shoulders. He seemed to make a decision. He gestured with his chin towards a fallen log opposite him across the small fire pit. "Sit." Ben sat carefully on the rough bark, the tension still thick enough to cut with a knife. He waited, letting Kane control the pace. "Hayes wasn't no killer," Kane said finally, his voice flat, devoid of its usual mocking tone, stating it as simple, incontrovertible fact. He stared into the glowing embers as he spoke. "He was a damn fool sometimes, yeah. Trusted the wrong people too easily. Like me, once upon a time, long ago. Got himself into scrapes. But he wouldn't kill a woman. Wasn't in him. Didn't have the stomach or the nerve for that kind of cold. The locket, Kane, Ben pressed quietly. How did he get it if he didn't take it off her? Kane picked up a long, thin stick and began poking methodically at the embers, sending small showers of sparks spiraling up into the night air. He didn't look at Ben. He found it, just like the poor bastard told you he did. Downstream from here a ways, snagged on some brush near that old lightning-struck sycamore tree, glinting in the moonlight. Then who dropped it there? Ben breathed, leaning forward slightly, his heart pounding. Kane stopped poking the fire. He looked up then, his eyes locking with Ben's across the dying flames, holding a chilling certainty. The man who killed her, Sheriff. The man who ripped it off her neck in his rage. Who? Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper, already dreading the answer he knew was coming. Kane let the silence stretch again, deliberately, perhaps savoring the moment of revelation, the shifting of power. Then he said, softly but with utter conviction, ask your respected citizen, Jebediah Granger, about his fancy bone-handled hunting knife, the one he's so proud of, keeps honed sharp as a razor. Ask him if he's used it lately. Ask him if he bothered to clean it properly afterwards. Ben felt a wave of physical nausea wash over him. Jebediah's knife? He'd seen it many times. Granger kept it in a display case behind the counter at the Mercantile, often taking it out to admire or to show off to customers, boasting about its perfect balance and German steel, a distinctive piece, instantly recognizable. Granger, Ben repeated, the name feeling foreign, unbelievable in this context. Why? Why in God's name would Jebediah Granger kill his own wife? Kane let out that dry, humorless chuckle again, the sound grating on Ben's nerves. Maybe because, Sheriff, she wasn't just his asterisk wife anymore. Not in her heart, anyway. He leaned forward conspiratorially, his voice dropping lower, intense, drawing Ben into the sordid secret. Martha Granger had appetites. She wasn't the timid little church mouse everyone in Redemption Gap thought she was. She liked excitement, liked attention from men who weren't her dull, predictable husband, liked pretty gifts he didn't give her, liked hearing promises of a different life, a life away from this godforsaken dust bowl and Granger's controlling thumb. And she found someone happy enough to provide all those things. Ben could barely breathe. Who? Me, Kane said simply, holding Ben's stunned gaze without blinking. The world seemed to tilt violently on its axis. Ben stared, speechless, trying to process the impossible revelation. Silas Kane, the dangerous drifter, and Martha Granger, the respectable merchant's wife? It seemed inconceivable. Met her in Prescott, a couple years back, Kane continued, his voice hardening now, taking on a bitter edge as he recounted the past. Granger was there on some extended business trip, buying supplies, left her alone in a hotel for days. She was bored, lonely, unhappy even then, restless, like your baker woman said. We had an understanding, a brief one. Didn't think much of it then. But I came through Redemption Gap a few months back, just passing through on my way somewhere else. Saw her on the street, looked her up. Things rekindled. He paused, staring back into the fire. A flicker of something unreadable. Regret, longing, crossing his face before the mask slammed down again. She was going to leave him this time. For real. Come away with me. Had her bags half packed under the bed, Sheriff. Just waiting for the right moment. Waiting for me to come back for her as planned. And Granger found out? Ben whispered, the horrible pieces of the puzzle clicking rapidly, sickeningly into place. Reckon so? Kane nodded grimly, his jaw tight. Reckon he found one of my letters I foolishly sent ahead. Or maybe he found a trinket I gave her. Or maybe just saw the way she looked at me when I rode through town that last time. He wasn't blind, just arrogant. He must have confronted her that night, after he got back unexpectedly from his trip. They argued, violently I imagine. She probably threw it in his face, told him she was leaving him for good, told him about me and his famous pride, his possessiveness. It snapped. Kane's fists clenched unconsciously at his sides. He used that fancy knife of his first, I figure, maybe threatened her, cut her, then strangled her to make sure she couldn't talk, couldn't leave. In his panic, he grabbed the locket. The one asterisk I asterisk gave her, Sheriff, not one of his expensive baubles, probably meant to dispose of it later, proof of her infidelity. Ransacked the jewelry box to make it look like robbery. Then he ran, blindly, crazily, out of the house in the dark, probably heading towards the creek to throw the locket in the water. Dropped it somewhere along the way without realizing. And Caleb Hayes, Ben murmured, the full weight of the injustice crushing him. Just damned unlucky, Kane spat, the word filled with bitter contempt. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong face. Found the locket the next morning, like finding a rattlesnake in his bedroll. And Granger saw his golden opportunity. A perfect stranger, a drifter with no ties, no one to speak for him. The perfect scapegoat. He probably planted some other small stuff, missing from the house later, just to shore up the robbery story. Then he stood on his porch, played the grieving widower, riled up the town with his tears and demands for vengeance, pointed the finger squarely at Hayes. And you, Kane's eyes, burning with cold fire, bored into Ben's across the embers. You obliged him, Sheriff. You did his dirty work. You stretched Caleb Hayes's neck for him, neat and tidy. The world tilted again, nausea rising in Ben's throat. He felt sick, hollowed out, utterly ashamed. He'd been played, expertly manipulated by Granger. The entire town had been played. Jebediah Granger, the respected merchant, the grieving widower, the pillar of the community, was a jealous, murderous hypocrite who had killed his wife and orchestrated the death of an innocent boy to cover his tracks. And Ben Carter, the steady hand of justice, the man sworn to uphold the law fairly, was his unwitting, eager executioner. Why? Ben finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse, choked with self-loathing. Why come back now, Kane? Why tell me all this? Why not just kill Granger yourself if it was revenge you wanted? Kane looked away from Ben then, towards the dark, flowing water of the creek, the moonlight catching the silver scar on his cheek. His hard, cynical facade seemed to crack for just a fleeting moment, revealing something raw and unexpectedly human underneath. Hayes, he wasn't much in the grand scheme, he said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion Ben couldn't quite name. Drifter, gambler, fool. But he didn't deserve that rope. He was my friend once, long time ago. Maybe I owed him something. Maybe I owed myself something. He looked back at Ben then. His expression shuddered again. Unreadable. Cold. And maybe I just wanted to see if the law in this town called Redemption Gap was really blind drunk on its own authority, or just conveniently looking the other way while a prominent citizen got away with murder. He stood up abruptly, dusting off his pants. It's your move now, Sheriff. You wanted the truth? Well, you got it, raw and ugly. Question is, what the hell are you going to do about it? Going to bury it again? Protect your town's reputation? Protect Granger? Or are you going to try and make it right, no matter the cost? Ben didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of the truth was too immense. The path forward shrouded in fog and danger. He watched Cain melt back into the darkness of the cottonwood grove, becoming one with the shadows, leaving him utterly alone by the dying fire with the terrible, soul-crushing weight of the truth. The wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves above, sounding like accusations, like the rustle of a hangman's rope. The place where the gallows had stood on the rise outside town suddenly seemed impossibly tall in his memory, casting a shadow that stretched all the way back through the weeks, engulfing his office, his badge, his very soul. He had hanged the wrong man, and the real killer wasn't just riding into town. He'd been there all along, hiding in plain sight, wrapped comfortably in a cloak of feigned grief and civic virtue, shaking Ben's hand. The twist wasn't just Cain's arrival or his connection to Martha. It was the deep, insidious rot at the heart of Redemption Gap itself. A rot Ben Carter had not only failed to see, but had actively helped conceal until it was almost too late. Or was it? The question hung unanswered in the cool night air. What asterisk was he going to do about it? The knowledge burned in Ben Carter's gut like cheap whiskey on an empty stomach, corrosive and sickening. Every time he saw Jebediah Granger now, behind the counter of the mercantile, forcing a smile for a customer, tallying figures in his ledger, nodding piously during Reverend Collins's increasingly pointed sermons, Ben felt a surge of revulsion so profound, so visceral, it nearly choked him. Granger, the murderer. Granger, the master manipulator. Granger, the man who had expertly played on Ben's ingrained sense of duty, the town's collective fear, his own meticulously crafted performance of grief, using them all as weapons to condemn an innocent man and save his own skin. And Caleb Hayes, forever swinging from that phantom rope in Ben's nightmares, his young life brutally extinguished because of this man's jealous rage and cold, cynical calculation. Ben knew he couldn't carry this burden alone, nor could he act rashly. He needed an ally, someone he could trust implicitly. He waited until late one night, long after the town had settled, and confided the whole ugly story to Eli Vance in the hushed, lamplit confines of the sheriff's office. He laid it all out. Cain's relationship with Martha, Granger's likely motive, the dropped locket, the suspicious knife, Cain's chilling confirmation by the creek. Eli listened intently, his young face growing paler and paler with each revealed detail, his boyish idealism visibly crumbling like dry earth under a harsh sun. The respect, the hero worship he'd always held for Granger, shattered before Ben's eyes. Granger? Eli breathed finally, shaking his head in disbelief, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Granger? But everyone respects him. He helped my pa out when the crop failed. He seemed so utterly broken up about Mrs. Granger. Seems he's a better actor than any of us knew, Eli, Ben said grimly, the weariness in his voice profound. Cain gave me the truth. I feel it down to my bones. It fits, Eli. Fits better than the story we bought hook, line, and sinker about Hayes. The problem is, right now, it's still mostly Cain's word against Granger's. And Cain, as the Rangers confirmed, is a known rough character, a drifter with a shady past. Granger owns half the town's goodwill, maybe more. Who do you think folks will believe if it comes down to just that? But the knife, Sheriff? Eli pressed, leaning forward earnestly, needing something tangible to grasp onto. Kane mentioned the hunting knife. Can we, can we get a warrant? Search his house? The store? Search Granger's house or store? Based on what? The uncorroborated word of a man like Silas Kane, a man who admits he was having an affair with the victim? Ben sighed heavily, running a hand over his weary face, the stubble rough against his palm. Granger would laugh us out of town, Eli. He'd lawyer up faster than lightning. He'd accuse us asterisk of harassment, of being influenced by a malicious drifter trying to stir up trouble. He'd turn the table so fast, make us asterisk look like the villains, persecuting a grieving widower out of spite or incompetence. He's smart, damn him. So what do we do? Eli asked, his voice filled with frustration and a dawning horror. We just let him get away with it? We let Caleb Hayes stay, wrongly accused for eternity? We just live with this? No, Ben said, his voice quiet but vibrating with a newfound steely resolve. A resolve born not of righteousness, but of deep, personal guilt and a desperate need for redemption. Not for the town necessarily, but for his own fractured soul. He had to try and undo the wrong he had perpetrated. No, we don't let him get away with it. We owe Hayes that much. We owe ourselves that much. But we have to be smart, Eli. Smarter than Granger. We need proof. Cold, hard, undeniable proof. Something that even Granger's influence and money can't explain away. Their chance, or perhaps Kane's deliberate, calculated provocation designed to force the issue, came sooner than Ben had expected. Kane, seemingly tiring of waiting for the sheriff to make a move, or perhaps driven by his own demons, started applying direct psychological pressure to Granger. He didn't make open threats, didn't lay a hand on him. He didn't need to. His mere presence, now imbued with the knowledge Ben shared with Eli, became an unavoidable, suffocating weight on the merchant. He'd loiter for hours outside the mercantile, his cold eyes following Granger's every move through the window panes. He'd appear suddenly and silently at Granger's elbow in the crowded saloon, or even on the street, murmuring something too low for others nearby to hear, but clearly unsettling the merchant profoundly, causing Granger to start and pale. Kane seemed to take a perverse pleasure in watching Granger unravel. The breaking point, the public detonation of Granger's carefully constructed composure, came, perhaps inevitably, during Sunday service the following week. Reverend Collins, looking more worried than usual, was delivering a particularly impassioned sermon on the inevitability of hidden sins finding the light, his gaze nervously flickering back and forth between Jebediah Granger, sitting sweating in his usual front pew, and Silas Kane, who sat impassively, almost disrespectfully, in a back pew near the door, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with cynical detachment. As the Reverend spoke of God's unwavering eye, seeing into the darkest corners of the human heart, Granger suddenly lurched violently to his feet, knocking over a hymn book with a clatter that echoed in the suddenly silent church. His face was slick with sweat, despite the relative coolness inside, his eyes wide and rolling with sheer panic. "He's tormenting me," Granger cried out, his voice high-pitched and cracking, pointing a shaking, accusing finger directly at Kane in the back pew. "Sheriff, do something! Arrest him! This man, he's trying to ruin me. He's spreading vicious lies, poisoning this town against me." The congregation gasped as one. All heads swiveled, shocked, between the agitated, almost hysterical merchant, the cold, unmoving stranger, and Sheriff Ben Carter, who sat grim-faced near the side aisle. Kane simply met Granger's wild gaze across the stunned silence, a faint, knowing, utterly chilling smirk playing briefly on his lips before vanishing. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Granger was doing his work for him. Ben stood up slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of every eye in the room settling upon him. This was it, the confrontation he'd both dreaded and, in a strange way, hoped for. The boil had been lanced. Now the poison had to come out. "Mr. Granger," Ben said, his voice calm but carrying easily through the sudden, breathless silence of the church. "Perhaps you should come down to my office where we can discuss this privately. You too, Kane. Let's sort this out proper, away from the Lord's house." Outside the church, under the harsh glare of the midday sun, a crowd gathered quickly, drawn by the unprecedented commotion spilling out from the sanctuary. Whispers turned into excited murmurs, then into open speculation as people saw Granger, still agitated and muttering, being escorted by Ben, while the unnerving stranger, Kane, walked with a chillingly relaxed stride beside a tense-looking Deputy Eli Vance. Ben walked slightly ahead, his mind racing, calculating. He still didn't have the concrete proof he craved, but he had Kane's detailed testimony. He had Granger's public outburst of panic, and he had a growing, gut-deep certainty that felt like solid ground beneath his feet. He had to force Granger's hand now, push him until the truth broke free. Inside the familiar, cramped confines of the sheriff's office, the air was thick with palpable tension, almost suffocating. Dust motes danced lazily in the bars of sunlight slanting through the window, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. Ben positioned himself deliberately behind his scarred wooden desk, the symbol of his authority, however tarnished he now felt it to be. Eli stood near the door, his hand resting consciously near his sidearm, his young face set and serious. Kane leaned casually against the wall by the two empty jail cells, arms crossed loosely over his chest, an impassive, watchful observer waiting for the final act. Granger, unable to stand still, paced back and forth in the limited space like a caged, frantic animal. "Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man," Granger insisted immediately, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and righteous indignation. "He's lying about me, about my dear Martha, trying to blackmail me. He's insane." "Blackmail you for what, Jebediah?" Ben asked quietly, his voice deceptively soft, letting the question hang in the air. Granger stopped pacing abruptly, looking flustered, caught off guard. For nothing. He's got nothing. He's crazy, I tell you. A worthless drifter, just like that Hayes fellow. Cut from the same cloth." The comparison slipped out, perhaps unintentionally, but it struck Ben as significant. "Funny you mention Hayes," Silas Kane drawled lazily from the corner, his voice cutting through Granger's bluster like ice. "Seems you had him pegged for Martha's murder right quick, Granger. Awful quick. Almost like you needed someone to take the fall fast." "He had the locket," Granger spat. Whirling around to face Kane, his face contorted with fury and fear. "Everyone knows that. You found it on him yourself, Sheriff." He appealed to Ben, seeking validation. "My locket," Kane corrected softly, his voice dangerously quiet. "The silver one I gave Martha because she admired one like it in Prescott. The one you ripped off her neck after you—" "Lies! All lies!" Granger screamed, losing control completely and lunging blindly towards Kane. Eli reacted instantly, stepping forward quickly, planting himself firmly in Granger's path, his hand now firmly on his gun. "Easy now, Mr. Granger," Eli warned, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Just calm down. All right, that's enough, Ben said sharply, his voice cracking like a whip, commanding attention. He stood up slowly, leaning his knuckles heavily on the desk, fixing Granger with an unwavering, penetrating gaze. He ignored Kane for the moment, focusing all his intensity on the unraveling merchant. Jebediah, Kane here tells a very different story about that night. He says you killed Martha yourself in a jealous rage because she told you she was leaving you for him. He says you used your hunting knife, the bone-handled one. He says you panicked, ran, dropped the locket near the creek, and Caleb Hayes just had the misfortune to stumble upon it the next morning. Granger's face went chalk white, then rapidly suffused with a dark, mottled purple flush of fury. He's lying! How dare you? How dare you listen to this? This piece of scum, this murderer, after all I've done for this town, after the tragedy I suffered. How dare you accuse me? He gestured wildly towards Kane. Oh, I ain't the murderer here, Granger, Kane said coolly, pushing himself off the wall slightly, his eyes glittering. We both know who is, but I reckon I know where the proof might be hidden, if the sheriff here has the sand to look for it. He looked directly at Ben, issuing a silent challenge. Check his house again, Sheriff. Or maybe check the store. Check for that fancy bone-handled knife. Bet you won't find it in its usual display case. Check for bloodstains he might have missed in his hurry to clean up. You can't, Granger yelled, pure panic returning, overriding his anger. You have no right. That's my private property. You need a warrant. You have no proof. He was backing away again, casting desperate glances towards the door. Maybe not, Ben conceded, his voice dropping low again, playing a hunch, watching Granger's eyes intently. He was bluffing, pushing, hoping to break through the wall of denial. But a man pushed too far. Sometimes he makes mistakes. Sometimes he gets careless when he thinks he's safe. Sometimes he hides incriminating evidence close by, thinking it's clever. Ben paused, letting the silence stretch, amplifying the tension. Like, maybe he didn't get rid of everything from that night. Maybe that fancy knife isn't missing entirely. Maybe it's just misplaced, hidden somewhere convenient, somewhere close. Granger's eyes, wide with terror, darted involuntarily, uncontrollably, towards the window that looked directly out onto the front of his mercantile store next door. It was a split-second reaction, a flicker of desperation, but in the charged atmosphere of the small office, it was as loud as a gunshot. Ben saw it, Eli saw it, and Kane, with a grimly satisfied look, saw it too. The store? Ben asked softly, keeping his voice level, almost conversational, locking on to the revealed weakness. Something hidden at the store, Jebediah? Is that where the knife is? Granger realized his catastrophic mistake instantly. His face crumpled, the facade of righteous indignation dissolving completely, leaving behind only raw terror and crushing guilt. No, nothing. There's nothing there. Leave me alone, please. He backed away further, stumbling against the wall by the door, trapped. Eli, Ben said calmly, never taking his eyes off Granger, don't let him leave this room. Granger completely panicked then. With a strangled sob, he shoved hard past Eli, fumbling desperately for the door handle, needing escape. But Kane, moving with the surprising, fluid speed of a predator, intercepted him easily, blocking his path with his body, grabbing Granger's arm in a grip like steel. Granger turned, trapped between Kane and the impassive Eli. desperation etched on every feature. His eyes darted wildly around the small, confining room, looking for any avenue of escape, finding none. The walls, the faces, the weight of the truth were closing in. "It wasn't my fault," he suddenly sobbed, the fight draining out of him completely, collapsing against the wall as Cain released his arm in disgust. The confession poured out of him then, tumbling over itself in a torrent of self-pity, justification, and wretched guilt. "She drove me to it. Don't you understand? Flaunting him, laughing at me, calling me old and dull, saying she was leaving, taking everything I'd worked for, taking my name, my pride." His voice cracked, tears streaming down his flushed face. I lost control. I saw the knife, my hunting knife. It was right there on the table where I'd left it after cleaning it. And then, afterwards, when they found Hayes, with the locket, it was like a sign, so perfect, a way out. I just had to nudge things along. Silence descended upon the office, thick and heavy, broken only by Granger's wretched, heartbroken sobs. The truth, finally, brutally, pitifully exposed in the harsh light of day. Ben felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound, bone-deep weariness and a lingering sense of nausea. He looked at Cain, whose usually impassive face held a grim, almost somber satisfaction, a debt finally, bloodily paid. He looked at Eli, whose youthful face was a mask of shock, disillusionment, and dawning understanding of the complexities of justice. He looked at the broken man, weeping uncontrollably against the wall, the pillar of the community revealed as a cowardly, jealous killer. "Eli," Ben said, his voice heavy with the weight of it all, "lock him up." Eli hesitated for just a moment, perhaps grappling with the reality of arresting the man he'd known and respected his whole life, then moved decisively towards Granger, pulling out the heavy iron handcuffs. Granger didn't resist, didn't even seem to notice, just continued to weep, his shoulders shaking. As Eli led the sobbing, shuffling merchant towards the empty cells, and the clang of the iron door echoed grimly. In the small space, Ben turned slowly to face Cain. "You got what you came for," he stated flatly. It wasn't a question. Cain nodded slowly, his expression unreadable once more. "Hayes can rest easier now, I reckon," he said, his voice quiet. He pushed himself off the wall, stretching slightly like a cat. "And you, Sheriff? Can you?" Ben didn't answer. He couldn't. He walked heavily to the window, looking out at the bewildered townspeople still gathered uncertainly outside, their faces a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and dawning horror as Eli emerged briefly from the office, locking the cell door on Jebediah Granger with a final, decisive click. He saw Mrs. Albright's hand fly to her mouth in shock, saw Hank the blacksmith stunned disbelief, saw Reverend Collins shaking his head slowly, his face etched with sorrow. The truth was out. Justice, twisted, delayed, and bought at a terrible price, had finally stumbled into Redemption Gap. But the cost was staggering. An innocent man hanged, the community's trust shattered into 1,000 pieces, a respected citizen revealed as a monster, and a sheriff left to grapple with the terrible, inescapable weight of his own catastrophic mistake, a mistake made not out of malice, but out of weakness, out of pressure, assumption, and a fatal failure to look beyond the obvious, convenient answer. He had upheld the law, finally, but he had also been its instrument of profound injustice. The climax hadn't been a dramatic shootout in the dusty street, but a quiet, devastating implosion of lies and self-deception within the four confining walls of his own office. And the loudest sound in Redemption Gap that day wasn't gunfire, but the deafening shattering of illusions. The aftermath in Redemption Gap was quiet, not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but a stunned, heavy silence that descended like a shroud, replacing the nervous tension of the preceding weeks. Jebediah Granger's confession, spreading through the town like poison seeping into the water table, ripped through the community's carefully woven fabric of trust and assumption, leaving behind raw shock, bitter betrayal, and a pervasive, collective sense of shame. People looked at each other differently now, the easy familiarity replaced by a hesitant suspicion, a questioning of judgments once taken for granted. They looked towards the empty rise outside town, where the gallows had stood, with new, horrified eyes, no longer seeing it as a symbol of swift justice, but as a stark monument to their own fallibility, their collective rush to judgment, their shared guilt in the death of Caleb Hayes. Silas Kane didn't linger. There was nothing left for him in Redemption Gap. With Granger locked away in the cell, awaiting the arrival of the circuit judge and the inevitable trial that would be little more than a formality now, Kane's grim purpose was fulfilled. He settled his bill at the saloon with Dusty's wife, who looked at him with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He nodded curtly, almost imperceptibly, to Ben as they passed each other one last time on the dusty main street. A silent acknowledgement. Nothing more needed to be said between them. Then mounted his dark bay horse, without a backward glance at the town that held so much pain for him. He rode out the way he came, heading west, disappearing back into the shimmering heat, haze from which he'd emerged, leaving behind a town grappling with an ugly, inescapable truth and a sheriff facing his own profound reckoning. He vanished as enigmatically as he had arrived, a catalyst who had forced a painful truth into the light and then moved on, his own demons perhaps slightly appeased, perhaps merely stirred anew. Ben Carter did not try to hide from his role in the tragedy, did not attempt to deflect blame or minimize his failure. The very next day, ignoring the advice of the shaken town council members who urged caution and damage control, he called a town meeting. Not in the church this time, nor the saloon, but out in the open, under the unforgiving sun, in the dusty plaza in front of the now silent mercantile. Granger's store closed and shuttered. He stood before the assembled townsfolk. Nearly everyone had turned out, drawn by morbid curiosity and a need for answers, not as their confident, authoritative sheriff, but as a man humbled, visibly broken, stripped bare by guilt. His voice, usually firm and commanding, was low, heavy with remorse, yet carrying clearly in the unnerving stillness. He told them the whole story, unvarnished, unsparing. Kane's arrival, the reason for it, his own initial dismissal turning to dawning suspicion, Granger's calculated deception, Martha's secret life, the misplaced locket, the hidden knife, the final, ugly confession. And then, the hardest part, he confessed his own part, his own blindness, his own failure. "I was wrong," he said simply, his gaze sweeping slowly over the stunned, pale faces before him, meeting eyes filled with disbelief, anger, and dawning shame. "Deeply, terribly wrong. I let the pressure, the town's anger, Granger's performance, I let it cloud my judgment. I wanted justice done quick, wanted the fear to end, and I didn't look hard enough. I didn't listen to the doubts whispering in my own gut. I didn't give Caleb Hayes the benefit of the doubt that every man deserves. He paused, swallowing hard. Caleb Hayes. Caleb Hayes was an innocent man, and I was the one who sent him to his death. The words hung in the hot, still air, brutal in their simplicity. Ben reached up slowly, his hand trembling slightly, and unpinned the tarnished tin star from his sweat-stained vest. He held it for a moment in his open palm, the metal feeling cold, heavy, alien. I failed him. I failed this town. I failed the sacred duty entrusted to me. He looked down at the badge, then up again, meeting the eyes of his community. I cannot in good conscience serve as your sheriff any longer. With quiet dignity, he stepped forward and laid the badge carefully on the top step leading up to the mercantile's closed doors, leaving it glinting forlornly in the harsh sunlight. Then he turned and walked away, shoulders slumped, through the silent, stunned crowd that parted instinctively to let him pass. No one moved. No one spoke. There were no cries for his resignation. His confession, his public act of contrition, was more profound than any demand. The weight of his mistake, his guilt, was palpable, shared now, in that heavy silence, by the entire community that had, only weeks before, clamored so loudly for Hayes's blood. In the following days and weeks, a quiet exodus began from Redemption Gap. Some families, disillusioned by the revelation of Granger's hypocrisy and perhaps their own complicity, or simply unable to face the tainted memory clinging to the town, packed their wagons and drifted away, seeking fresher starts, cleaner air elsewhere. The town felt emptier, quieter, the dust settling a little deeper in the abandoned storefronts, the laughter harder to come by. Redemption Gap seemed to shrink in on itself, wounded and uncertain. Eli Vance, though deeply shaken by the events and the loss of his mentor, stayed. He felt a duty to the place he called home, a need to help rebuild what had been broken. The bewildered town council, rudderless and lacking any other obvious candidate, hesitantly asked him to serve as acting sheriff until a permanent replacement could be found or elected. He was young, perhaps too young for the burden, but he possessed a quiet integrity, a thoughtfulness, and now a sobering, first-hand awareness of the terrible pitfalls of the job, learned through Ben's tragic fall. He accepted the tarnished badge Ben had left behind, picking it up not with pride or ambition, but with a heavy sense of responsibility and a prayer that he could do better. One of his first official acts, carried out discreetly with the help of Hank the blacksmith, was to supervise the final dismantling and removal of the stacked timbers of the gallows from behind the livery stable. They burned them one night, letting the smoke drift away on the ever-present wind, erasing the physical reminder, though the scar on the land and on the town's soul remained. Ben Carter remained in Redemption Gap. He couldn't bring himself to leave, feeling perhaps that staying was part of his penance. He sold his small house near the edge of town, moved into a simple room behind the livery stable. He took a job helping Hank at the smithy, grueling, physical labor under the blistering sun, shaping hot iron with sweat and muscle, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, a steady beat against the turmoil in his own mind. It seemed to offer some small, tangible measure of atonement. He spoke little, kept mostly to himself, avoiding the pitying or accusing glances of his former neighbors. But his presence, the presence of the former sheriff now working as a blacksmith's helper, was a constant, quiet reminder to everyone in Redemption Gap of the fragility of justice, the danger of certainty, and the enduring, crushing burden of conscience. He seemed to age quickly in those months, the lines on his face deepening like carvings in old wood, his once steady gaze now often turned inward, searching for something he might never find. The town didn't forget. It couldn't. The name Redemption Gap, once perhaps chosen with hopeful optimism, now carried a heavier, more profound irony, a stark reminder etched into the very dust of its streets. True redemption, the remaining townsfolk learned slowly, painfully, wasn't found in swift vengeance or blind certainty or influential citizens. It was found, if at all, in the difficult, humbling process of facing ugly truths, acknowledging terrible mistakes, forgiving the unforgivable, including oneself, and choosing a harder, more thoughtful, more compassionate path forward. Justice, they learned in the harshest possible way, wasn't just about punishment. It was fundamentally about truth. And truth, sometimes, arrives riding a dusty horse from out of nowhere, speaks in riddles and accusations, demands a terrible, painful price, and leaves behind a silence that echoes louder than any gunshot. Sound of gentle, reflective acoustic guitar music begins, subtly underscoring Joe's closing remarks. Asterisk, asterisk, Joe Rivers. A heavy tale, that one. Heavy as the desert sun at high noon, heavy as a guilty conscience in the dead of night. Out there on the frontier, life moved fast. Decisions often made faster, sometimes too fast. Decisions made in the heat of the moment, under the weight of fear and expectation, could cast long, dark shadows that stretched across years, across lives. Sheriff Ben Carter. He learned that bitter lesson in the hardest way imaginable. He learned that justice ain't some neat destination you arrive at quick and certain. It's a rough, winding path you gotta walk carefully, questioningly, always ready to admit you might have taken a wrong turn, even if it means stumbling back in disgrace. It teaches us something vital, doesn't it? About the inherent danger of absolute certainty, especially when that certainty is fueled by fear or anger or the simple, seductive desire for an easy answer. It teaches us about the quiet, immense courage it takes to admit a wrong, especially a profound, life-altering wrong, not just to others, but to yourself. Ben Carter lost his badge, lost his standing in the community, lost the respect he'd spent years building. But maybe, just maybe, in losing all that, he found something else, something more essential, a measure of hard-won peace, perhaps, found only in the painful act of acknowledging the whole truth, however shattering, and accepting the consequences. The story of Redemption Gap, of Sheriff Carter and Caleb Hayes, and Silas Kane and Jebediah Granger, it serves as a stark reminder that justice requires so much more than just a badge and a rope and a loud voice demanding vengeance. It requires doubt, healthy, persistent doubt. It requires listening, truly listening, especially to the voices that are quietest or most inconvenient. It requires the humility to accept that we might not have all the answers, that the obvious suspect, the easy scapegoat, might just be a scapegoat. It demands we look deeper, question harder, challenge our own assumptions, and hold on to our shared humanity even, perhaps especially, when the crowd calls loudest for blood. That deep-seated need for justice, for fairness, for truth, it's woven deep into the fabric of the American spirit, part of the promise this land offered. Stories like Sheriff Carter's, painful and cautionary as they are, serve as vital markers on that ongoing journey, reminding us of the constant vigilance required, the moral compass we must always strive to keep true, even when storms of fear and anger threaten to spin it wildly off course. Think on this story tonight. Think on the terrible weight of consequence, the quiet courage of confession, the often underestimated strength it takes to face the unvarnished truth when comfortable lies feel so much easier to live with. What does justice truly mean to you in your own life, in your own community, in these complex times? How do we ensure we foster doubt, encourage listening, and seek the deeper, often more difficult truth, instead of always reaching for the simple, satisfying, but potentially devastatingly wrong answer? If this voice from the past spoke to you tonight, if the echoes of Redemption Gap and its hard-learned lessons resonated in your soul, do me a kindness. Share this story. Let these voices, these lessons forged in hardship and regret, travel onward, carried on the digital wind. And if you find value in hearing more tales of the West, tales of the struggles and triumphs, the failures and redemptions that shaped this nation and continue to speak to us today, well, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. Join our circle around this modern campfire. We've got more stories to tell. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your heart true, and never stop listening to the whispers on the wind. They often carry the truths we most need, yet least expect, to hear. This is Joe Rivers for Asterisk, Voices of Justice Asterisk, wishing you clear trails ahead and honest, thoughtful reflections along the way. Good night, friends. 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 Good night, friends.